Democracy and journalism are not synonymous either. There was no journalism in ancient Greece. British journalism evolved under a constitutional monarchy. American journalism operated under a monarchical colonial power, and it preceded American democracy. But as Michael Schudson has observed in his excellent book, Why Democracies Need an Unlovable Press, I quote, "Where there is democracy, or where there are forces prepared to bring it about, journalism can provide a number of different services to help establish or sustain representative government." Now, what are those services and why do they matter? Once again, I'm indebted to Schudson for setting out some easily comprehensible categories. First, there is the function of informing the citizen. This is primarily education. It enables the public to make political choices and participate in self-government. So to recast Lippmann's earlier image in a more positive light, news tells us things that we would not otherwise know. Such informative journalism takes many different forms. It could be an interview with a businessman or a politician, a report or a court hearing or a House of Commons debate, or even a dispatch from the front line of a war. The essential point here is that informative journalism enables citizens to have indirect contact with people of power or institutions of the state to better understand how society works, both to their advantage and to their disadvantage. Reporting of criminal court cases, for example, strengthens the public awareness of the state's capacity to protect its citizens through the justice system. Such reporting is intrinsic to civil society, and that incidentally is why we should be very worried about the demise of local newspapers, which have traditionally spent so much time and space covering local courts of justice, and indeed local government. The second function of journalism in a democracy is that of watchdog. Investigative, as opposed to informative journalism, is by its nature confrontation. Its goal is to prevent abuses of power, to expose immoral, unethical, or illegal behavior by agencies or individuals. The investigative tradition goes back at least as far as the early 20th century, when the so-called muckrakers, love that word, exposed social inequities and corruption in the big cities in America. The investigative journalist is the self-styled professional truth-teller, intrepid in the face of official censure and dedicated to the proposition that citizens in a democratic society are entitled to hold powerful people to account. You can tell I was a member of the Insight. By far the most famous example of investigative journalism was, of course, the Watergate scandal. It was exposed, among others, let's not forget the New York Times, it was exposed by two Washington Post reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, and ended in the resignation of President Richard Nixon. In retrospect, as I've written, Watergate may have been a curse as well as a blessing for American journalism. The Watergate-inspired movie, All the President's Men, made celebrity a goal to which many journalists now aspire. It may also have bred a generation of cynics with little or no faith in American political institutions, but that's another story. Closer to home, the most recent example of successful investigative journalism has been the Daily Telegraph's exposure of systematic abuse in parliamentary expenses claims. Here, I tip my hat to the Telegraph and to its editor, Will Lewis, who just happens to once work for the Financial Times. But they have pursued courageous and diligence. They pursued in a manner which is courageous and diligent, an important and groundbreaking story. Many of the damning details of MP's claims, right down to the duckhouse and the rural moat, would never have come to light had disclosure been left to the discretion of our elected representatives in the House of Commons. And even though the material, in this case a computer disk, was acquired in exchange for money, there can be little doubt that publication of the story was in the public interest. By contrast, revelations about phone hacking by the News of the World raise serious questions about the practice of journalism in the public interest. News International, which owns the News of the World, as well as the Sun, Times, Sunday Times, and the Wall Street Journal, continues to cast the practice as an isolated operation, albeit one which led to the jailing of one of its former royal correspondents. The Guardian's story that News International secretly paid at least one victim of phone hacking £700,000 in compensation is troubling. As the Guardian rightly observed, the press cannot expect to be immune from public concerns about access to databases and personal information, whether it be CCTV, medical records, ID cards, or mobile phones. More important, the press needs to be very careful before appearing or putting itself above the law. In this case, the Regulation of Investigative Powers Act 2000, under which the News of the World reporter was jailed, or the Data Protection Act of 1988. The latter act does contain a public interest defence, which can be pleaded in court, but such a defence will cut little ice with juries if the public comes to assume that all news organisations are running rogue operations guilty of gross intrusion into privacy. Moreover, the balance between privacy and the protections afforded by current UK libel law, arguably a much more serious obstacle to serious investigative journalism, need to be reviewed in my view.